Hello and welcome to the first Media Society podcast. In this podcast series, we're going to be talking to people in the media about current media issues. I'm Nigel Dacre, I'm the president of the Media Society, and I'm really pleased that for our first podcast, we're joined by Ritula Shah, former BBC radio presenter, now at Classic FM, and also a Media Society ambassador. So Ritula, thank you so much for joining us today. You were at the BBC for many years, now you're at Classic FM. How's that going?
It's fantastic. Thank you for having me, first of all, Nigel. It is fantastic at Classic FM. Handbrake turn from news, which I readily admit. But as my son put it when I was weighing up what to do with my life, he goes, "Mum, what could be so bad about playing 3 hours of classical music every night as your job?" And he's absolutely right. It is lovely. And it's a very different way of connecting with the audience. In news, you are often the deliverer of difficult things, of depressing things, whereas on Classic FM with Calm Classics, I'm there to give people a lovely end to the day. So it's quite nice, really.
Of course, you're quite used to working late in the evening, both at the BBC and now at Classic FM.
I have become a night owl. 10 o'clock seems to be my time of day in the evening. It is a downside. I don't go to bed very early, ever. But on the other hand, I think I've always been a bit of a night owl. So it probably suits my personal body clock.
So, working for Classic FM after so many years at the BBC, Classic FM is part of the global group, a very commercial radio operation. Is it a very different atmosphere working there?
Yes and no. I think what's different is people do obviously immediately think about, is this something that is commercially viable? Can we get sponsorship? They ask questions like that. On the other hand, the things that I would say are the same are the enthusiasm, the demand for standards, the creativity. So all the best bits of the job, I would say, are the same. I think there's also a responsibility that comes with being a public service broadcaster, which is different and is difficult at times. It weighs on you. But I actually think the fact that in the commercial sector, things are agile, teams are lean, people make decisions much more quickly, I would say. Those things are all to be praised, and I enjoy working in that environment. I think I've really appreciated having the change. That's not to denigrate the BBC and public service broadcasting, but I have enjoyed a different way of working and a different way of evaluating the world.
Okay, interesting. We'll talk about the BBC a bit more in a moment, but just taking a step back and looking at your career, in an interview you said you'd had an accidental career. What did you mean by that?
So it's quite hard to describe. I was brought up in one sense, in what you might think of as quite a traditional Indian way, an expectation to be a wife and a mother. On the other hand, my father, who had those expectations, also really, really valued education. So I got this tip-top education, and he was very proud of that and very proud of me and wanted me to do well in my life and in my career, whatever that meant. But at the same time, I had to also be quite a traditional idea of what a wife and a mother should be. And I imagined that marrying those things was going to mean that my career would have to fall away. Thanks to circumstance, my husband, the fact that I just loved what I did, things just carried on and we muddled through. And so what I'm trying to say, I guess, is I didn't set out to be an amazing journalist and broadcaster, to have these incredible opportunities given to me. It kind of just happened. I wish I could tell you that I'd had a 5-year plan. I tell people, when I mentor people now, young people, I kind of say, well, think about where you want to get to and think about the steps you're going to take to get there. Well, I didn't do any of that. I just kind of fell from job to job and thought, well, at some point the road will run out. And at that point I'll stop. But it kind of just carried on.
Well, you had and are having a very good career, so you must have done well along the way.
I don't know. I think you have to work hard. I think I did work hard and did a lot of night shifts over the years. But I think you also need other people. It's not just about me. It's about the people you work with. I was very fortunate to work with some amazing editors, amazing producers, part of fantastic teams. And I think you rise and fall depending on the people around you. And if you work with good people, you get better. And I think I've been really fortunate with some of the people I've been able to work with.
Yeah, interesting. So what do you think? I'd quite like to probe you about what you think makes a good presenter. I've worked over the years with many presenters in TV and in radio. And it's not easy. If people think it is easy, it isn't. And the ones who've been successful, in my view, are the ones who've worked at it, who've actually thought about the craft. And so, what do you think? I mean, how did you sort of adapt your style, and what did you learn as you went along about what makes a good presenter, particularly on radio, as that's your area?
I think the first thing is being willing to listen. I just think you've got to listen to what the other person is saying. And it's surprising. If you go to a party, I'll offer you a little experiment. Go to a party and ask someone a question and strike up a conversation. And the number of people that will keep answering your questions, but they won't actually ever bother to ask you a question in return. And it's because they are absorbed in themselves. They're not actually thinking about the fact that it might be polite, or it might be, just a good thing to do, to have the curiosity to ask the other person a question. I think as a presenter, you've got to be willing to listen and be curious. The listening, the curiosity, I think, is true of many, many aspects of journalism. But the listening part, when you're presenting, you've got an agenda, you've got a list of questions that you want to ask, but you have also got to respond to what the person in front of you is saying or doing. What's their face saying? Are they upset? So I think that is the primary thing. An aspect of the job that I think has really changed in the time that I've been doing it. I used to feel that I was a cipher, that I was there on behalf of the audience, and actually me as a person was not the important thing. I was there on behalf of the audience, and actually it was better if I was quite a sort of neutral, vanilla kind of figure. That has really changed. I think now, presenting in radio and in TV, it's the whole be a personality, be larger than life, which I don't love, but that's what's changed, and whether I love it or not is kind of irrelevant. But I think the listening and the curiosity, and also the willingness to prepare. When I was pretty early in my career, I was presenting PM, and for the first time I was getting sort of big political interviews, which are hard. And I interviewed, this is so long ago, I interviewed Michael Howard, who was then the leader of the Conservative opposition. That tells you how long ago it was. And I was nervous, and there's no two ways about it. And I probably hadn't prepared enough, and I messed it up. And we came off air, and the editor was like, oh, well, it didn't go well, did it? Which was absolutely a fair comment. And so we talked about it a little bit. And it was I was mortified, and I was really upset. But it was a really big lesson for me, because what I realised at that point was, in that sense, it isn't about you. It is about you preparing and being there and being willing to ask the questions that need to be asked, because you are representing the audience. They are not, now with social media, perhaps they do get the opportunity to ask a question. But back then, they really didn't. And if you didn't ask it, then nobody was going to. So.
I'm sure. Yeah, one of your editors described you as having a persistent but polite style. Now, I would say that would put you in contrast to some of your former colleagues, say, on the Today programme, who you would call them anything but polite, I would say. Is that a description that you recognise, that you sort of worked at?
I don't know that I worked at it, but I would say, yes, that's fair. But I think I'm going to defend my colleagues on the Today programme. I think Michelle Hussein is possibly the best interviewer in the business, in my opinion. I think she's incredibly polite and very sort of forensic. I think Nick Robinson is terrier-like, and yes, he can be robust, but I think there is a place for that, and I do value the way in which he's able to challenge, sort of recalcitrant politicians. I think you have to work with who you are and the skills that you have. I am never going to be able to be like Nick Robinson, and possibly not like Michelle Hussein. So you've got to work out, who am I? What can I bring to this party? And I think the thing that I can bring is that I really care about the issues. I do want to find out what the answers are. And I would like to think I try to be polite. So in a way, you're seeing a version of me. You're seeing a version of my personality, a little bit superannuated.
Yeah. The persistence is probably the important bit, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. You can't give up. And I think that goes back to the Michael Howard example. You can't be scared and you can't give up. This person they've got what they want to get out of that interview, and you've got what you want to get out of that interview, and you've got to hang on to that idea.
Of course, again, with my experience with presenters, we really from the editorial side, from the programme editor side, really respected those presenters who could deal with things when everything went wrong or there was a massive breaking story. If it was a pretty standard day and you'd had quite a time to prepare for the interview, then a lot of people can do that. But not many presenters, and I could name the ones I won't do, but the ones at ITN, when there's a breaking story, they didn't have a script in front of them, they had to ad lib. That takes real skill. So you must have had a lot of time dealing with breaking stories. How did you deal with that?
Well, in fact, to bring it up to date for a moment, after I left the BBC, 2 or 3 months later, I was walking down the road and one of those news alerts went off on my phone. I immediately whipped out my phone and it was, I think it was a coup in Ivory Coast or something. And for a few seconds, I froze on the street thinking, right, what do I know about Ivory Coast? What do I know? What am I going to talk about? And I suddenly thought, you don't need to know anything. Like, nobody cares what you think. And I could sort of palpably feel the relief. It is the need to be able to live off your wits and what you've read and what you remember that often really comes into play. I think the point at which there's 2 points at which I felt I really learned lessons. One was during the Gulf War, the second Gulf War. I was at the World Service, and I used to do this shift at the time that was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and it was 5 till 7, something like that. And all the news would come in during this 2-hour period. So you would literally have a blank sheet of paper and story after story would be coming your way. And then British politicians would do the Today programme, and then some hapless producer would say, would you do the World Service as well? And they'd come on, but I would be given a minute's notice, and you'd have the Defence Secretary in front of you. That honestly teaches you to live off your wits. You just understand that you've got to just keep thinking, stay on top of what's happening. And I think sometimes breaking stories can be the easiest because there's a story to tell. You are revealing something to the audience as you are finding out about it yourself. So you're taking them with you. And as long as there is a good production team who are kind of pushing stuff through the pipeline, as it were, it's actually quite easy to deal with. You just have to keep your nerve, that's all.
Okay. The BBC have had a lot of criticism the last few months, haven't they? They've had a pretty torrid time. BBC News in particular. I was thinking about this. Obviously, when you presented the World News Tonight, night after night, you would have seen the best of BBC journalism in many ways, wouldn't you? You'd have been speaking to the correspondents all around the world. What is your take on how BBC News is doing currently?
Look, there have been mistakes. I mean, there's no two ways about that, and I don't think anyone's going to argue about that. Do I think that the BBC is anything other than impartial? Absolutely not. I know how hard thousands of individuals within that organisation work every day to try and be impartial and to present a factually accurate version of the news. And I think that's true. We are very lucky in the UK. I think you can look at our news broadcasters across the board and see that happening all the time, and that is an extraordinarily fortunate thing. I personally believe the BBC has been too weak at defending itself and not strong enough at putting its hands up and saying, really sorry, look, we made a mistake, this is why it happened, and this is how we'll change and move on. And I think those two things, not actually defending yourself and not admitting you're wrong, have allowed so much latitude for its critics, of whom there are many, to really take aim and fire. And it's terrible. I feel very sad. I think we'll be a much poorer country and a much weaker democracy if we don't have a really strong news kind of ecosystem, and the BBC is absolutely central to that.
Okay. I suppose you mentioned impartiality. Has that? I mean, one of my thoughts on it is that impartiality has become so complicated compared to when I was doing programmes like News at 10. I think because the society has become so fractured and polarised on so many of these issues. Did you see how did you approach the impartiality issue when you were working? Did you see it change over the years? I
definitely agree with you that society has become more complicated. Just think about the political system. For most of my life, we had a two-party system with the Lib Dems kind of on the sidelines. Where are we now? It's a multi-party system, and that is reflected in society, a multiplicity of views. I don't think impartiality, and obviously it's due impartiality that the public service broadcasters are obliged to adhere to, which is that idea that it's not, it's not just 30 seconds of this and 30 seconds of that. Over time, you have a chance to reflect many views over a period of time. I used to imagine impartiality as being standing in the middle of an issue and looking around and looking at all the potential different viewpoints. They don't all necessarily have the same weight, but to appreciate that there are a multiplicity of viewpoints and then think about the ones that are most relevant or most important and play with those and work with those. I do think that the environment has changed so much. So when you're the BBC, a big national broadcaster, people hold you to account because you are not reflecting their point of view. And I think it's impossible. I don't think you're ever going to be able to satisfy everybody all the time. I think that impartiality at that point has to rest on a better kind of explanation of the facts. Let's say this is what we can all agree on. This is the part we can all agree on. And these are the views that flow from it. I think that foundation of facts becomes really important. But even that's a contested space now. So I don't think things are going to get easier in this realm of impartiality. But I definitely, to come back to that word persistence, I don't think that's a reason to give up.
Okay. Well, look, we could talk at great length about impartiality. I'm just interested on the BBC World Service. You spent a lot of your career working at BBC World Service. That's also going through a lot of changes, a lot of cutbacks. What is your view now of the BBC World Service and its place within the kind of even the global media, I suppose?
So my frustration is that politicians pay an awful lot of lip service to the World Service. Oh, marvellous, marvellous. And you wonder how many have actually listened. But it's, since the funding was taken out of the Foreign Office, there have been cuts, year-on-year cuts. I think it just seems to me so short-sighted, especially at a moment in which the United States is on the retreat globally. At least in that public-facing way, when you think about the cuts to USAID and they've cut funding to Voice of America and so on. I think it's a really obvious and important role as an English-speaking country that we can play, one that many people, for good or ill, feel connected to through history. So yes, it has been cut. And I have so many stories of going to bits of the world where when you say you're from the World Service, people are so pleased to see you. And I think as a piece of soft power, it is extraordinary. But are people demoralised within it? Absolutely they are. And things are getting harder because of those cuts in America. One of the funding streams for the World Service is that it sells some of its programming to NPR stations and so on in the States. Well, they are now under enormous funding pressure. That's another funding stream which is under threat. I can't understand why this government, understanding the world as it does and seeing itself as something of a Trump whisperer, rightly or wrongly, doesn't actually see that funding the World Service is a very easy way for it to maintain the relevance of the United Kingdom.
Okay. Look, let's move on to one of the other big areas in the kind of audio world, if you like, which is the development of podcasts. You spent your career in what I could call sort of what you call linear radio, where people will turn on at a particular time to listen on the radio. But habits are changing, aren't they? Podcasts are just going to get a bigger slice, I imagine, of the audio listening market. On the other hand, there are so many podcasts, aren't there? I mean, I don't know about you. I can only listen to so many podcasts in a week. So, what's your thoughts about podcasts and how that industry is developing?
So podcasts are here to stay, right? They are, in some ways, I feel less like this now. But when it first was starting to take off, I was sort of slightly irritated almost by the and it was the Americans that first really latched onto podcasts. I was thinking, well, you're just doing what we've been doing for years in speech radio, and kind of trying to claim it as something new. So podcasts are enormous. There is a bit of a retrenchment right now, actually, where you've seen a lot of funding withdrawn and consolidation. So the danger in that is that you have a race to the bottom. So what's getting funded right now tends to be celebrity-driven, kind of two people talking, as opposed to perhaps some of the more beautifully produced kind of long-form investigations and dramas and things that we saw even a couple of years ago. Podcasting is here to stay. As someone who loves audio, it's kind of something I've been attached to ever since I can remember. I think it's great. I think it's fantastic that we have more people listening. That's kind of, for me, that's makes me very happy. I do think we need to arrive at a place where there is a bit more quality control. One of the things that really worries me, concerns me, is that whereas the rest of the media, linear radio and broadcasting and TV and stuff, are regulated, there is no regulation of podcasting. And I think sometimes a lot of the so-called factual podcasts play fast and loose with facts, and that worries me in that whole misinformation, disinformation sphere. You know, are you actually hearing somebody who may be putting out spurious scientific views being held to account, or have you just got a presenter who's nodding along without actually ever challenging what can sometimes be some quite dangerous views? And you will hear that in big mainstream high audience podcasts. That really worries me. So that's, to me, that's the downside. The explosion in audio, well, I can only be happy about that.
Do you think the style is different from producing a half-hour radio program on a linear channel to producing a half-hour podcast? Do people need to think in a very different way, or is it, as you mentioned, is it really carrying on the same craft that's been developed for decades?
It's definitely developing its own language, isn't it? I find the talking heads thing just astonishing, but I mean, listen, people want to listen to it, then why shouldn't we do it? And this move to video as well is quite odd for someone who's always worked in audio. But you know, you've got to go where the audiences want you to be. I think it's interesting, isn't it? It developed its own cliches quite quickly. The sort of the producer on the phone, you know, and you hear the producer having the conversation with, and it's it became a trope in podcasts. In the same way that back in the sort of 90s and the 2000s, the ringing phone was a real sort of cliche in the radio package. So it has its own language. I think one of the good things it's done is it's loosened up more formal radio. We're all much more conversational now, which I think is probably a good thing. As I say, I think that the thing that I would say really good speech radio, whether it's in a commercial station like LBC, or whether it's on Radio 4 or Radio 3 or 2, the difference between those and a podcast is, I do think people are very conscious of facts and content and being within the law. I mean, there is, these stations are regulated, and I wish there was a way of regulating podcasts a little bit so that you could guarantee standards.
It's an interesting point. What about the saturation point? How many, is there? Do we think there's just still a lot of growth for podcasts? There's just a lot more podcasts that can be produced, presumably in ever more niche areas. So, do we think there's still a lot of sort of headroom and scope for growth in the podcast business, or are we getting to some sort of level where enough podcasts and new ones just won't be able to take off?
Well, if you look at the numbers, there was a chart this week which I can't remember. I wish I'd sort of written it down. But Goalhanger, the rest is, they dominate in this country. I think they had 4 or 5 of the slots. Don't quote me on that, but they had an awful lot of those top 10 podcasts. So in that sense, you could say, well, no, we're at saturation point. If you're not worried, the thing is, making a podcast is cheap, right? You put 2 people in front of a microphone and off you go. You press record, relatively. So, in a sense, if your passion is brass hinges on Victorian doors and you want to make a podcast about that, what's to stop you? You might have an audience of 10, but if those 10 people are passionate, then that's kind of viable. So, in that sense, there's no limit. I think if what we're talking about is how many people can make money out of podcasts, we are beyond saturation point, because the amount of advertising there is to go around, particularly in the current environment, is finite, and therefore you've got to have box office numbers of audience in order to attract that advertising if you're actually going to make it pay. If you're doing it as a passion project, well, I think we can have as many podcasts as we want. Or if you're doing it as a marketing ploy, I mean, a lot of companies have podcasts because they see that now as quite an important strategic ambition. But in the entertainment and kind of journalism sphere, I think advertising is the limiting factor.
Okay. I mean, my general sense is we're just bombarded with so much media, aren't we? I mean, I'm feeling constantly guilty that I haven't read the newsletters that I've been sent or the Substacks I should read, let alone watch the old mainstream media programs that I should try and watch as well. So there's just an enormous amount of media, isn't it? It's fragmented, but it's just increased dramatically in volume. I suspect it will reach its own sort of levels, but there's a lot of media around, isn't there?
And I think for sort of, you and I, who grew up in an age where media was a sort of precious commodity, it's quite hard to watch it being turned into something that is, as sort of like soap flakes, or it doesn't have a huge intrinsic value because anyone can do it and there's so much of it. And that's quite hard because nothing has changed at the kind of top end, in that it still takes time, money, effort, brains, all kinds of things, collaboration, teamwork, to put out the best kind of media. But at the other end, it's very easy to put two people in front of a microphone or a camera.
Okay, and here we are adding yet another podcast to bombard people.
I'll leave you to observe that.
Indeed. Look, let's just talk about you for a moment. I read with interest that a few years ago when you left the BBC, you just discovered that most of your male colleague presenters were being paid more than you. It made newspaper headlines. You were pretty angry at the time. Are you still cross about it?
Not cross about it anymore. It rankles a little bit. I mean, it was sorted. It was resolved. So I have to be grateful for that. I just think it's sad that situation ever arose, and it wasn't just me. It was many, many other people. I hope that we would never go there again, especially in a public organisation like the BBC. Structures were put in place and stuff after that, so I would imagine that it wouldn't be allowed to happen again now. Trying to be more positive about it, I think it reflects the fact that my career took place through a period of change, a period when I began, there weren't that many women in those roles, and by the time I finished, there were many more of us. Perhaps not as many as there should have been, but many more of us. But yeah, it does. I see myself as someone really fortunate, who I feel as if I've been given opportunities. I've worked with really lovely people. So to then discover that perhaps some of those people that you trusted didn't really have your best interests at heart, that's quite hard. It kind of knocks your sense of trust in human nature. But hey, it's life, and I live to see the other side.
I suppose the issue there was you being a woman, obviously, against the men who were being paid more. You're also a woman of colour. Looking back on your career, how have those factors affected, and what impact have they had on your career? So
being positive about it for a moment, I think being different, a small brown woman, makes you stand out. And I think, if I think about how I got my very first job, it was a student radio conference, and there was the head of the BBC in Birmingham was speaking. And at the end of it, my friends were like, go on, ask him for a job. It was like a dare, literally. So I just thought, okay, what have I got to lose? So I go down the steps and I just march up to this man, and it sort of makes me cringe thinking about it now. And so, I work at the student radio station. I'd love to work for the BBC. Would you give me a job? And he literally looked at me and laughed, because I was being so sort of pushy. And I just felt idiotic. But, he said, well, write to me and we'll see what happens. And then I applied for a couple of jobs, which I didn't get, and various things happened. But I stood out, right? I was a small brown woman, a small brown gobby woman, who dared to ask. And he clearly thought that was kind of, it counted for something. So that's the positive side. I'd walk into rooms at Westminster, which were largely full in those days. This is the early 90s, full of white men. And I would be one of the only women, and then a brown woman. And so people would notice you, and I don't think that was a bad thing. I think the downside is, I think I was probably a bit naive and a little bit too grateful. Oh, I'm so lucky to be here. And that's probably what allowed me to be quite so naive about money. And I think that there were points when I think men kind of made decisions, male bosses tended to say, well, you wouldn't want to do that, would you? Because you've got a young child. And you think, well, hang on a minute, why don't you let me make that decision? I'm not even sure what I think, but actually don't tell me that's the decision that you've made on my behalf. So there were definitely moments like that. But I think I've been very fortunate. I recognise not everyone has been as fortunate as I have been. And now, at this point in my life and my career, it's really important for me to kind of pay back and try and help other people navigate a system that's changed a lot. So I sometimes feel, gosh, I'm not sure how to help you because I'm not sure I understand how it works now. But at least to give people the confidence to try and to feel that they deserve a place and they absolutely must have a place, because for the media to be useful, it's got to have a range of voices. It can't be all women or all men or all short brown people or all tall white. Do you know what I mean? It's got to be, we all have to have a place there.
Okay. Well, that's a very good way of putting it. Listen, I think we're coming up to our time. I just wanted to ask you that you've very kindly agreed to be an ambassador for the Media Society. So you'll moderate some of our events next year. You'll come to other events. Can you just talk a bit more about why you were happy to accept that role?
Well, I'm very excited to be part of the Media Society. It's got, a long kind of illustrious history. And I think actually it's a great place to end this conversation because I think it touches on so many of the things we've talked about. I want to pay back. I think it's a way of giving back to young aspiring journalists, people who want to be part of the media in many different roles, to kind of open doors and perhaps show what's possible. And also, I think it's such an interesting time in the media. We talked about podcasting, but, the way in which social media has changed the landscape, the arrival of these big platforms that are challenging our very rich heritage of broadcasting. So there's lots of things to talk about, and I'm really excited to be part of that conversation.
Well, thank you very much. And Rita, thank you for joining our first podcast. If you're listening to us or you're watching us, look out for more podcasts from the Media Society. But Ritula, thank you very much and goodbye.